I moved into that apartment in late October, mostly because it was close to work and I was tired of commuting. It was a narrow building from the 70s, 6 floors, no elevator. The rent was reasonable. The landlord lived in another city and handled everything by email. Nothing about it felt unusual. My routine at the time was simple. I worked normal hours, came home around 7, cooked, read, and went to bed early. I didn't have much of a social life then, which suited me fine. The building was quiet. I rarely saw my neighbors. That was one of the selling points. The first thing that stood out happened during my second week. I came home later than usual, close to 10. As I unlocked my door, I noticed the smell inside the apartment was different. Not bad, just stale, like a room that hadn't been aired out. That didn't make sense since I lived alone and had been gone all day. I checked the windows. They were closed. Nothing seemed disturbed. I assumed it was my imagination and went to bed. A few days later, I noticed something else. The kitchen chair was pulled slightly away from the table. I was certain I always pushed it back in. I remember thinking about it longer than necessary, then deciding I must have forgotten. I had been tired that morning. I didn't feel afraid. Not then. It was more like a mental note. Over the next couple of weeks, small things like that kept happening. A cabinet door not fully closed. The bathroom light switch flipped down when I was sure I'd left it on. Once, a book I'd left on the couch was back on the shelf. None of it was dramatic. Each thing had a reasonable explanation on its own. I started paying more attention to my habits. I checked locks twice. I took photos of rooms before leaving for work, mostly as a way to reassure myself later. The photos always matched what I came back to, mostly. There was one evening when I noticed the bedroom window was unlocked. I never unlocked it. I didn't like sleeping with windows open, especially on the 3rd floor. I stood there for a while, holding the latch, trying to remember if there was any reason I would have done it. I couldn't think of one. That night, I slept badly, not because I felt watched or threatened. It was more a sense of unfinished thinking, like my mind couldn't settle on a conclusion. Around that time, I started hearing sounds at night. Not loud ones. Just the building settling, footsteps in the hallway, pipes. That's normal in older buildings. What bothered me was the timing. The sounds always came after midnight, and they always seemed to pause when I moved. I tested that idea more than once. I would lie still, listening, then shift slightly or clear my throat. The sounds would stop. Then, after several minutes, they would resume. I told myself I was pattern hunting. People do that when they're stressed. I had read enough about it to recognize the tendency. The midpoint, looking back, was the night I heard someone try my door. It was a soft sound, not a rattle, more like a careful turn of the handle. I was awake, reading, I froze, listening. The handle moved once gently, then stopped. No knock, no footsteps afterward. I waited for several minutes before checking. The door was locked. The hallway was empty. The building had old carpeting that muffled sound. Whoever it was could have walked away without me hearing. I reported it to the landlord the next day. He suggested it was someone drunk or a neighbor at the wrong door. That explanation made sense. I accepted it. Still, I bought a cheap camera and pointed it at the door from inside the apartment. It wasn't connected to the internet. It just recorded locally. I didn't tell anyone. I felt slightly embarrassed about it. For the first week, nothing happened. I reviewed the footage every few days, just me coming and going. Then one morning, before work, I noticed the camera had been turned slightly toward the wall. I was certain I hadn't touched it. I checked the footage from the night before. At around 2:40 a.m., the recording glitched for several seconds. When it came back, the camera angle was different. There was no visible movement, just the change. I tried to convince myself it was a technical issue. The mount was loose. The file was corrupted. Those things happen. That evening, I tightened the mount and marked its position with a pencil line. The next morning, the line no longer matched. I didn't go to work that day. I stayed home, sitting in the living room, trying to think through what I actually knew versus what I felt. I checked every lock. Everything was secure. There were no signs of forced entry, no missing items, no damage. That was when I noticed the closet. It was a shallow utility closet near the front door. I rarely used it. Inside were cleaning supplies and an old folded ladder. When I opened it, the ladder was unfolded, just slightly, as if someone had started to use it and stopped. I stood there for a long time. The ladder was dusty. The dust was disturbed. That was the first moment I considered calling the police. I didn't in the end. I couldn't explain what I would say. Nothing had been taken. There was no evidence of a crime. I worried it would reflect poorly on me. Instead, I decided to stay with a friend for a few nights. I packed a bag and left the apartment exactly as it was. When I returned 3 days later, the apartment was clean, cleaner than I had left it. The trash was taken out. The sink was empty. The bed was made with hospital-like precision. I checked the camera immediately. The memory card was gone. I moved out the following week. I didn't argue about the lease. I paid what I owed and left quietly. The landlord didn't ask questions. For a long time, I told myself a simple story. Someone had access to the apartment. Maybe a previous tenant. Maybe the landlord himself. Maybe a neighbor. It explained most things. What still troubles me is the timing. The restraint. The fact that nothing overtly threatening ever happened. Whoever it was didn't steal, didn't vandalize, didn't escalate in obvious ways. Sometimes I think it was someone living there without my knowledge, hiding in plain sight. Other times, I wonder if stress and isolation did more to my memory than I realized. I still have the photos I took before leaving for work. I still compare them occasionally to my recollections. They don't prove anything. I live somewhere else now, a newer building. More noise, more people, I sleep better. But every now and then, when I come home and notice a chair slightly out of place, I pause longer than I should. I don't panic. I don't jump to conclusions. I just stand there, trying to remember what I know for certain.